Welcome to Voices of the Valley, a captivating podcast series that brings together some of the brightest minds in the agriculture industry. Straight from the field to your living room, we explore the challenges, innovation, and triumphs in modern-day farming and provide insight for consumers who are curious about where their food comes from.
Hi, welcome back to Voices of the Valley. I'm your host, Taylor Lauson, Communications Manager at Western Growers. Water is one of the most important and often misunderstood topics in agriculture. Today's guest brings a wealth of knowledge and a unique perspective on how water is managed, conserved, and delivered to support food production across California and beyond. Joining us today is Michelle Paul, Executive Director of the California Farm Water Coalition. Michelle, thank you for being here. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Taylor. It's an honor to be with you today.
When people see crops growing in a field, of course, they know water is involved, but they may not understand the extensive journey that water takes before it ever reaches a plant. So can you walk us through what actually happens when water goes from the source to a crop?
Yeah, that's a great question, Taylor. And to back up one level again, for your listeners, I want to share that the California Farm Water Coalition is a nonprofit organization, and we are bipartisan. What our purpose is to help consumers and elected government officials, representatives, and the media understand the connection between farm water and our food supply. So the conversation today is right up our alley. And as you already stated in your question, how water is delivered in California is an enormously complex topic. So anyone who works in water will probably say the same thing, that no one is an expert because there's always something new that pops up year to year. But the foundations of it are pretty basic. So, the complicated issue with water deliveries in California is that while most of the watershed happens up in the northern part of the state, the majority of the population lives in the southern parts of the state. A lot of the really nutritious and rich farm ground that we have in our state that benefits from our beautiful Mediterranean climate is in locations where the rainfall isn't direct. So we have, through many centuries of work, have figured out a way to deliver that water to the locations where it's needed. So water irrigated agriculture particularly originates from four main sources. You've got our mountain snowpack, which has been a really rich source for water all through the hot summer months and into the fall for us. Rainfall, of course, occurring throughout the year, but with our Mediterranean climate, it really just falls in the winter months and in the spring. That rainfall is also stored in rivers and reservoirs. We have access to the Colorado River for our Imperial County, Coachella Valley growers, and our groundwater aquifer, so water that's stored underground in the sandy layers, especially in some of the areas of the Central Valley and the North Sacramento Valley, really rich aquifers throughout the state. Water itself, I think it's important to mention, water is free in the state to actually use the water that's here. It's the delivery of that water that we all pay for, the cost to deliver it to the location. So that's why in locations that are not immediately next to a water source, that cost for the water is going to be a little more expensive because we have to convey it really long ways.
So I think when people are imagining farmers watering their crops, they're still kind of like, even though there's so much technology and advancements, I think people still kind of imagine, someone turning on a sprinkler or, just kind of like those older images that we grew up with. But obviously modern agriculture is so much more sophisticated than that. So how do farmers decide when to irrigate and how much water a crop needs? Because obviously, like you said, you have to pay for that water delivery. So obviously, they need to be very strategic about that.
California's irrigated agriculture, we have always been very progressive in our technology and in our efforts to apply just the right amount of water for the crop and the soil requirements. Today, it's an astounding 56% of farms in California that are irrigating utilizing really high efficiency application like drip or micro irrigation. And then about a quarter of all farms are using sprinklers on some or all of their acreage. Water is an expensive product. It's an expensive input for California farms. So oftentimes, as the farmer's planning on how they're going to manage their crop, they're wonderful businessmen and women. They're looking at how can they be very precise and efficient with the water application while also maintaining an appropriate amount of yields. One thing we say at the coalition is, food grows where water flows. And that's a very accurate statement. The really key part of being an excellent grower in the state is understanding what are your soil requirements and how does that translate to the crop that you're able to grow in your location. If you under irrigate, you can sometimes, like with wine grapes, pull out additional flavors. They'll stress the plants a little bit. But in other cases where you're growing, our wonderful peaches, huge peach crop here in our state, if they're overwatering, you're eliminating some of the nutrients that are in the soil that go in to produce a really, really delicious product that consumers love in the grocery store. One common misconception around agriculture water use is oftentimes we hear the talking point that agriculture uses 80% of the water in the state. That's really a misrepresentation of the reality. Roughly half of the water that we have captured in our surface water conveyance systems is reserved for environmental purposes. We had a very robust native fish population in the state, and as those populations have declined, there's been a critical need to allocate water flows, cold water flows for healthy fish populations. But really what that means, in correcting that error, is agriculture really only uses 40% of the individual water use in the state. The remaining goes to industry and to urban uses, but that 50% is reserved, for those environmental purposes.
Right, because agriculture doesn't just mean, crops. Like there's a whole other agriculture industry out there.
Yeah, and oftentimes, especially when there's a drought, it's easy to start pointing fingers and, you get on the opposite sides of the table with groups that really have interests aligned with you. I think that there's a very important thread that flows between creating habitat and environmental care that agriculture plays a massive part in. A great example of this is we haven't really talked about the different, specifics around the irrigation types in the state, but flood irrigation often comes under the microscope when water is scarce. And rice is one of those commodities that must be grown underwater. It's grown in flooded rice paddies. In our state, in the northern part of the state, that has created a huge habitat rich with nutrients and food sources for the Pacific flyway. And when our rice fields are flooded, millions and millions of migrating birds find respite in our rice fields, and it's a great food source as they continue their traditional migratory patterns. So that's just one example of how the environment and agriculture can be and are mutually beneficial in many, many cases.
Yeah, and since you brought it up, I'd like to talk a little bit more about some of the most common irrigation methods used by California growers today, and maybe explain a little bit as to why they choose to irrigate the way they do.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing for us to touch on next. The most efficient practice to irrigate in agriculture in California is going to be drip irrigation. That covers a wide variety of application techniques, but really at its core, it's a network of plastic tubing with little small emitters that drip water slowly at the base of the plant. Anyone that has a home garden, if it's tomato growing season here right now, you're familiar with this. What is really commonly used, but also expensive to develop, is subterranean or subsurface drip. And what that means, especially in row crops, lettuce or some of those special, delicate specialty crops that are planted each year, is that those drip lines are planted underground, under the dirt, which makes it enormously efficient. Water is applied directly at the root base, and there's very, very little, almost no evaporation, making that about 90% efficient, very little water loss. Another common method that is, just about as equally efficient as micro sprinklers. This is a lot more common on permanent crops where you have a larger root base that you need to apply water to. So, citrus, almond orchards, a lot of those growers are using micro sprinklers under the tree canopy. They're highly efficient because they are not experiencing the same sort of evaporation that you would get with either overhead sprinklers or with flood irrigation. Drip is wonderful, micro is wonderful, but it doesn't necessarily work when you're trying to start up a crop. So for carrots or some other products that need the seed to actually be germinated, there's really no other option except for some sprinkler irrigation. The final method that has really been becoming less popular, and for a couple of different reasons, is flood irrigation. Now, flood irrigation is where it's all gravity fed for the most part. And once it's on farm, the water's been moved on farm, it fills into the furrows in between rows and irrigates the crops that way. Now, some crops, like I mentioned, rice a minute ago, they must be irrigated using flood irrigation. And certain soil, health, certain soil constraints may not allow any other method but flood irrigation. For example, up in the north part of the state, the soils are really heavy clays, and so they don't have necessarily the same water loss that you would have using flood in areas where you have evaporation, but also the water that's being applied to the rows percolates into the groundwater. One thing I do want to point out that can be very helpful with floodwater in our state, we've been seeing, especially south of the Delta growers, they're receiving a smaller and smaller surface water allocation due to some environmental constraints with how water moves through our San Joaquin Delta. That has forced many folks, in order to keep their crops alive, to pull water out of the ground. And one thing that flood irrigation is very helpful with is recharging that groundwater aquifer. So as the state has become much more efficient in applying drip irrigation, micro irrigation to these crops, there has been less groundwater recharge that has been a secondary benefit of that programming. Growers are applying less water, so they're saving money, and they're being very efficient, which is wonderful. But the groundwater aquifers are not receiving that same bump that they used to when the majority of the state was irrigated with flood.
I was thinking when we were just recently on the Cultivate California tour, it was raining really hard in Salinas, and they were still watering the lettuce, and we were like, just, hey, why are you still, watering when it's raining? And it's just funny because that is like an initial, sort of like, okay, that's strange. But then when they're like explaining to you, like, yeah, I mean, it is raining, but it's not enough to really water the crops and have an even, nice watering. It's just not enough to skip a water because it's raining. And I think just even things like that, where it's like, oh, okay, there is a reason, there is thought behind this. It's not,
Yeah, and it's not enough that it just rains. It needs to rain at the right times. So controlling the weather is always, one of the biggest challenges when you're producing agriculture at the scale that we do in this state. We are so incredibly blessed by our rich soil and our incredible weather here in California. And that allows us to be the largest ag producer in the nation by a lot. The second runner-up isn't even close to the amount of volume we produce. One common, question is, why are we putting all of this water on crops that ultimately are exported? That's a frequent question that we get. I think it's really important when being presented with that question to think about the fact that water stays with the food that it's grown. It requires water to grow food. And in our state, we have certain soil constraints. We have certain environment where we can grow a wide variety of crops, but not all the crops that we eat here in the state. So I think it's really important to remember that while we do apply a lot of water, in 2022, 8.2 trillion gallons of water were used in our state to produce food and fiber. But as far as what was consumed, because so many people live in this state, 11.3 trillion gallons of water per year were consumed in food products. So we are still not producing enough food to support the population that lives here. That's really an important way to think about it when you see that agriculture is 40% of the water use in the state.
I think you've done a great job at kind of explaining about how the water is allocated, where it's coming from. So I do want to touch on again, though, in your opinion, what makes farming in California uniquely challenging when it comes to water? And how does that compare to, say, neighboring states like Arizona or Colorado?
It's a great question. I don't know that I would try to position the state as, more difficult than, other areas. Each region has its own water wars that are equally challenging for the folks that are trying to operate in that system. But really what makes California so incredibly complex is, first of all, we're operating on a system that was designed for less than half our population. So we just don't have the water management skills that we need. So within this already restrained environment, you have many, many interest groups. There's so many different state and federal agencies that are operating here. You have a very large environmental coalition that is working to elevate, their priorities. You have irrigation districts and those protecting really senior water rights, folks that have rights to pull water from the stream based on, a long history. You have a really delayed policy around how we pull water out of the ground that's increased a lot of really serious risks in the state. For many years, we had no regulations around how water is pulled out of the ground. And that's created some very big complications when you think about it from that perspective. The regulatory environment in the state is extensive. And there are some benefits, of course, to having some regulations. In California, we produce the safest and the healthiest food with farm workers that are cared for and have access to resources more than, I would say, anywhere else in the world, arguably. But it does come at a cost, and it comes at a cost at the grocery store. So, we are so incredibly fortunate that when we're in say a Sacramento or an LA, Santa Monica grocery store, and we walk in, our shelves are stocked full of beautiful varieties. And they've only traveled maybe a day or two, if that, to get to those shelves. It's just not that situation in the rest of the world and the rest of the state. Traveling to the East Coast or into Canada, you don't have that kind of variety. So it does come at a cost, though. The prices are being impacted. I think that growers every year have to make really difficult decisions on how are they going to reduce their costs in order to stay in the game.
You mentioned California was late to the game in groundwater pumping regulations. Could you expand a little bit more about that?
Sure, I'm happy to. Recently, we have experienced something really unusual in certain parts of the state. As environmental constraints to water that's moved through the San Joaquin Delta, which is where many watersheds kind of join together and into an estuary and slowly make their way out into the bay, the San Francisco Bay. We have some pumping plants at the south of that area. And that's how we move water often through two major pumping plants from the north of the state, where we have the largest snowpack, down to the southern parts of the state, where a lot of the agriculture and the residents are. As different environmental constraints have been in place in the Delta, the amount of water that's allowed to move through those pumping plants have been constrained. Now, what that means is that the water that the growers south of the Delta have relied on for decades in order to irrigate their crops has been shrinking. So in order to keep their trees alive, they turn to groundwater pumping to fill the gap, particularly in high drought years. So in that case, you have a lot more water being pumped out of the groundwater aquifers than have historically been the case. And for a long time, we have been pulling more water out of the ground than what has been recharging those aquifers in our wet periods. Now, what that does is essentially it creates a vacuum underneath the ground, and the ground actually starts shrinking because there's not that water between the subterranean layers in order to prop it up. Now, that becomes a really big problem when you think about the water canal system. California had, the innovators that developed the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project and other projects throughout the state. They were really smart and it knew that the least expensive way to move that kind of volume of water is to do it through a gravity-fed system. Well, when the ground starts sinking, that gravity system begins to collapse. So we've been having a problem called subsidence here in the state, where the ground has been shrinking and it's really negatively impact how much water can move through our water projects to the southern part of the state. In fact, the DWR, Department of Water Resources here in California, has estimated that 90% capacity will be lost in the State Water Project canal system if nothing is done to mitigate this by 2040. So because of what we've been seeing happening, there was some landmark legislation. Again, we were one of the last in the nation, which is not typically our marker when it comes to California policy, to regulate how groundwater is pumped out of the ground and how much you can. So a really landmark legislation called the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, was implemented about 10 years ago with a graduated implementation timeline to the point where 2040, we will have zero negative balance in how much water is being pumped out of our system and how much water is put back into the groundwater aquifers. So the complicated situation here is, the surface water deliveries continues to reduce. We are consistently seeing less and less water moving south of the Delta to growers. And in other parts of the state, I don't mean to focus exclusively on the Central Valley, but that's where the greatest impact has been seen and been monitored. So in this case, you have growers being told they can't access water to farm their land that they've been doing for 6-7 generations sometimes. And really the result of this is anywhere between 500,000 and 1 million acres of agricultural land that's going to be fallowed in the coming years. We are just now seeing the bite of this legislation on the local economies and the local townships. Many of the communities that growers are operating in, they live in, they work in themselves, their kids go to school in, are disadvantaged communities. So, it becomes additionally complicated because you have all of these local towns who are losing a very key source of their economic, ability to thrive and develop. It's towns based on agriculture, and you're having significantly less agriculture in the state in those areas. Another thing to mention just logistically about how this program has been implemented, it's really intuitive in understanding that water management is really best done at the local level. So what the legislation did was require groundwater sustainability agencies, or GSAs, to be established all throughout the state to manage these groundwater aquifers, which vary. There's significant, I think over 400 of them. So these GSAs had to first be created, and then second, they had to come together. Mostly local water users are sitting on these GSA boards, and they're deciding and developing, with staff, of course, these groundwater sustainability plans. And it is how that local area is going to achieve a net zero draft on the groundwater basins by 2040. And then those plans had to be approved by the state for feasibility. That's an enormous logistical lift when you think about an area that has really moved into decentralized water application to be able to develop all these new they're public agencies, and develop these plans. So we have been moving at light speed here in the state, and the impacts are significant, very significant, and really cannot be understated what it will likely do, not just to the folks that are living in the areas that are farmed, but also to the price of food. If you have that much volume going out of production, you're going to see costs in the grocery store markets go up. You just will. There's less volume. It's an invisible hand, right? There's less product out there, so the cost is going to go up. I think it's also important to note that you can't just stop farming this land without considering some of the environmental impacts that will happen. If you take land out of production and do nothing with it, You have potential for dust and air quality issues, all sorts of complications from, managing the ground so that we don't have a dust bowl like what we saw in our nation's history. So that's a little bit about Sigma and what's going on in the state. It's really taking up a lot of the air in most rooms that growers are gathering in. They're feeling the impacts of this, and it's something that we will be working on for quite some time.
Yeah, it's really good to have on your radar. I'm sure, it's hard to stay in touch with every bit of policy and everything that's happening, but I mean, it sounds astounding the amount of work that's been done in 10 years. So I'm really excited and I'm hopeful that the great work is continuing and some of that preventative action and proactive action can help in the long run. It's what I'm hopeful for.
I think so. And California and California growers, they are innovators. It's really amazing. And we've shared some statistics in this podcast about how effective growers have been in adapting to whatever is coming, whether it be, new technology that they're applying or just working together, working collaboratively in ways that they haven't done before. And I really anticipate that continuing.
Okay, great. Well, with our last few minutes, I'm kind of just going to do like a little rapid fire and you can just tell me what comes to mind about water use. So what changes or innovations in water management are you most excited about right now?
Technology, and I'm curious about AI and how that will change automated watering systems.
Love that. What gives you optimism about the future of farming and water management?
The innovative spirit. Growers in this state, growers nationwide, are very committed and they believe strongly in what they do and they feel like they have great purpose. So that keeps them going and that keeps me wanting to help every way that I can.
Agreed. And okay, before we wrap up, if listeners remember just one thing about how farmers use water in California, what should it be?
Oh, that's a good one. California's weather is boom or bust. We call it weather whiplash, I think mostly because it's fun to say, but that really makes it complicated to farm. So you have growers trying to produce a steady yield every single year, trying to navigate really complicated weather issues and to do it as cost effectively as they can so that all of us are paying reasonable prices at the grocery store. So I think just remembering that growers are looking to do what's right by the world. They're environmental stewards. They care for the land. They really care for the ecosystem. And they really want to do what's right.
Absolutely. I completely agree. All right. And for listeners who want to continue to stay engaged in what's happening with water in California, how can they follow you or find you on social media?
Sure. We have a couple of active programs on social media that are probably your best source to find news. Our California Farm Water Coalition profile is up and running on LinkedIn, but you can always connect with me, Michelle Paul. I'll be posting pretty regularly about the work that we're doing and content we're putting out. We also have a wonderful Instagram program that just passed 100,000 followers. We're very excited about it. It's Cultivate California. And we would love for you to find us on Instagram, engage with us, follow what we're putting out there. We do a lot of on-farm tours and try to dispel some myths about agriculture and water application.
Well, congrats on 100,000. That's a great milestone.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay, well, Michelle, thank you so much for being here today and for taking the time to explain can be a bit complex, can be a bit hard to understand, but I think you really boiled it down, especially for someone like me too, who's still learning about this. So I'm really appreciative of you taking the time. And I think, water may be the subject of policy debates and complex regulation, but its importance comes down to something simple. Without reliable water, there is no reliable food supply.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Food grows where water flows.
Thanks for tuning in to Voices of the Valley, a Western Growers production. As always, we'd like to give a special shout out to our guest for joining us. Don't forget to like and subscribe to catch our future episodes, and we invite you to follow us on social media to continue the conversation.